Welcome to our presentation for Chatham History Weekend. We're calling it the world's greatest coastal station, and we'll go into that in some detail. We should probably let people know where in the world we are. This is for Chatham folks, History Weekend, but there are others tuning in through Eventbrite. Just make sure we know where we are here. So we're on the coast of Massachusetts, on Cape Cod, and on a bit of Chatham that faces the Atlantic Ocean. We're in a very protected inlet from the raw ocean, and in a part of town that was known as Chatham Port. This is what the property looked like in the early part of the last century. These buildings are all part of the radio station here. At this time, when these buildings were built, the land in this part of town was said to have fallen into disuse and be of little value. Here's a sign that was in front of the property for a good part of the early part of the century. Radio Marine Corporation of America, a subsidiary of RCA, shore to ship, Radio Marine Coastal Stations, WCC. Here's a sign that was up later in the century, RCA Global Communications, a different division of the Radio Corporation of America, Marine Radio Station, WCC. So coastal station, ship-to-shore station, marine radio station here in Chatham. Here's a sign that's out front of the property today. Because of the history and significance of this radio station, the property is on the National Register of Historic Places. It's known as the Marconi/RCA National Register District, and it's home to the Chatham Marconi Maritime Center. This building on the property was where radio operators did their work. Here's the operating building today. It is the home of the Marconi RCA Wireless Museum here in Chatham Port. Here's how the building looked in 1921. It looks pretty much the same as it does today. There's a little addition in 1921. The company car you can see here in the shadows. Here's another view of the property from 1921. This building here is a multi-story building, which was a residence for the employees, the radio operators that worked here. The station was featured in a magazine almost 100 years ago, and here's an interior shot of this building here. Social room at the hotel for the staff at Chatham, Massachusetts. And as you listened to Carolyn, you saw the fireplace behind us here. This is the fireplace. Here's a better view of it from a nice glossy picture, not from the magazine. This is where the radio operators gathered and lived 100 years ago. Here's what the building looks like today. Outside, there's a banner on it. The banner says Chatham Maritime Radio launched 100 years ago, 1921, and it says it's the world's greatest coastal station. We'll talk about how that came to be. Here's the piece that may have drawn you here about today's History Weekend. If we look at this little synopsis, I want to pull out a few things. 3 consecutive centennials. I suppose every year is a centennial of something, but these were consecutive centennials of very significant things. Call it a pivotal era in the history of communication. I want to take you through that pivotal era and see where things might have fallen and how they fell where they did. Chatham at the forefront is where we end up, and with the world's greatest coastal station. So Centennial in 1919 was the beginning of the Radio Corporation of America. Centennial in 1920 was the inauguration of transoceanic radio communications between the United States and Europe. And in the 1919 presentation, we had a sort of a subtext, which was the future of radio and the technology that was coming into play in 1919. So the pivotal era. We were in 1919, had just come out of World War I. The armistice was signed in 1918, and the disruption of the war was abating, and peacetime was upon us. Government and private enterprise. During the war, government had taken over radio facilities in the United States. Private enterprise had given up their rights to operate radio stations, and it was under the umbrella of the Navy. Spark to CW. Now, this is technology. We don't need to go into the technology per se, but just understand that there was early ways of generating radio waves and later ways of generating radio waves. Think of this as the old technology and the new technology that was on the horizon back then. British Marconi and RCA American. Guglielmo Marconi was an inventor with an Italian father and an Irish mother. His roots were in England, and he established companies engaged in wireless telegraphy. Many countries of the industrialized world had companies that bore Marconi's name. In 1919, the Radio Corporation of America came into being as an all-American company, and we're going to talk about that. Transoceanic to marine. This is a particularly important aspect of what went on here in Chatham, and that will all be explained when we get to it. I have to mention vacuum tubes. This is another bit of technology that was in the offing in this era, and it revolutionized communication. Also, I need to mention broadcasting. This is the only time I'll say the word broadcasting. The radio communication that went on in this station and other stations like it had nothing to do with news, weather, and sports in the home. But in this era, broadcasting actually had its birth. KDKA in Pittsburgh is recognized as the first organized broadcasting station, and it went on the air in 1920. So, beginning of RCA. These particular aspects of the pivotal era are not disjoint, they're not one after the other, they're linked. And the technology, the old technology of spark and the new technology of continuous waves, and the transition from British influence in America to an American company are intertwined. In 2019, here in the museum, we had a banner on the building because our exhibit was celebrating the centennial of the beginning of RCA. To talk about that a little bit, I want to bring in a publication that RCA put out in 1949 on the 30th anniversary of 1919. And when you open this up, first page says RCA, what it is and what it does. The second paragraph is what led to the formation of RCA. Prior to and during the First World War, the United States depended largely on foreign-owned cables and wireless stations for communication with many important parts of the world. Great Britain was the communications center of the world, and indeed it was. This is a map of the world. You can make out the land masses, showing cable connections across the continents and across the oceans. This is from 1904, and up here in the northeast United States and England, and a lot of cables connecting the two continents. Communication center of the world. The war revealed to Americans that radio offered a new and competitive system, an opportunity to win preeminence for the United States in radio communication. Subsequently, RCA was formed as a result of suggestions by officers of the United States Navy. Arrangements were made to acquire the assets of the Marconi Wireless Telegraph Company of America. That's the American company that bore Marconi's name. And a charter was granted to RCA under the corporation laws of the state of Delaware in 1919. So what about those suggestions and arrangements? Suggestions were by officers of the United States Navy. Here's an officer of the United States Navy. This is Commander Stanford Hooper, who at this time was head of the radio division in the Navy Department. Here's his superior officer. This is Admiral Bullard, Director of Naval Communications, Navy Department. This is not an officer of the United States Navy. This is Owen Young of the General Electric Company. General Electric Company, industrial giant in American industry. At this point, Owen Young is Vice President and General Counsel, and within a matter of a couple of years, he'll be Chairman of the Board of that great company. A little more about Owen Young. You may not know him now, but if you were living back in these early decades of this century, you might, because he was on the cover of Time magazine in 1925, and he was Time's Man of the Year in 1929. Commander Hooper wrote an article in June 1922 in a magazine, and the name of the article was Keeping the Stars and Stripes in the Ether. And this will reveal a lot about what was going on back then. The British Marconi Company, having previously enjoyed possession of ownership of the most valuable radio patents, were tardy in their research work, as they apparently felt that they enjoyed a monopoly in this respect and need have no fear of a competitor. It was apparent, however, that they suddenly became convinced that if they did not get hold of certain General Electric patents, either the patents themselves or the license right of them, they would be unable to compete long in modern radio. So Marconi Company was dominant in radio, but we're coming to a point after World War I where technology is advancing and Marconi Company might not be able to compete on the basis that it had previously enjoyed. Unable to compete long in modern radio because it was obvious that a company having the improved apparatus covered by these patents could cut in on them seriously and perhaps drive them out of the field. This is intertwined with spark, the old technology, and continuous waves, the new technology. Spark was the Marconi method of generating radio waves. Continuous waves, the modern way of generating radio waves developed by General Electric. Negotiations were entered into with the General Electric Company by the British Marconi Company following the war. And when Hooper heard of this impending deal, he became convinced that the whole future of American radio communication was involved. I communicated with the General Electric Company and requested that we be given an opportunity to meet the directors on very important matters at the earliest possible date. As a result, a conference was arranged with General Electric officials This conference taking place on Broadway, New York, April 1919. Admiral Bullard very ably presented the Navy's point of view to the conference and impressed the officials of General Electric with the seriousness of the situation. Mr. Young, Owen Young, of the General Electric Company became convinced that it would be unpatriotic for the company to continue its plans with the British Marconi Company, and that there was nothing to do but to cancel the proposed agreement with the British Marconi Company. So the latest technology in radio generation, radio transmission, was in the hands of General Electric, and the Marconi Company needed it in order to continue its position in the field of communications. This is the technology. This is a General Electric machine. Marconi spark method of generating radio waves was something like bottling up lightning. It was kind of a brute force approach. This was a rotating machine with smooth operation that generated radio waves mechanically, electromechanically. It's called an Alexanderson alternator. Here's another view of an Alexanderson alternator, a pair of them in use here in Massachusetts. So cancel the proposed agreement with the British Marconi Company. Comes the question of what do we do with this alternator? General Electric points out that they manufacture radio locomotives, but they don't run trains. They manufacture power generating equipment, but they don't run public utilities. They have this alternator, and now they have nobody to sell it to. It was suggested that the General Electric Company establish an international communication system which would use the alternator. Footnote 10 on this clipping. Footnote 10 lays the responsibility for that suggestion on Hooper. So unable to compete, Hooper said that they would be unable to compete, and Marconi recognized it. American Marconi circular to stockholders, a 3-page document, was distributed over the signature of John Griggs, the president, in 1919. Marconi Company was a very significant company. Griggs was a very significant man. He was a former Attorney General of the United States. But he writes that a corporation has been formed called the Radio Corporation of America, and etc. He lays out the conditions, particulars of what this pending situation is, and ends up saying that we request consent be given by the stockholders to the sale of the assets of the company. On its first day of business in December 1919, RCA owned only 5 radio stations in various stages of completion. The Federal Trade Commission did a report on the radio industry, and we draw from that one radio station was the pair at New Brunswick and Belmar, New Jersey. In this era, a radio station consisted of a transmitting site and a receiving site that operated as one. So this is New Jersey. Marion and Chatham, Massachusetts. Bolinas and Marshall, California. And in Hawaii, Kahuku and Koko Head. Remember Kahuku. We're going to say something about Kahuku a little later. And one more, which was something that came out of the war. This was a German property, a German station built for the French, actually, that had been seized by the alien property custodian during the war. But RCA inherited that when they bought the assets of the Marconi Company of America. When the war came, the Marconi Company had erected and nearly ready for operation long-distance stations at New Brunswick and Belmar, and had in the course of construction stations at Marion and Chatham on Cape Cod. for communication with Norway. So as war came to the United States, the New Jersey station was poised to go on the air. Chatham was still under construction. So British Marconi interests in 1919 yielded to the Radio Corporation of America American interests. The RCA charter specified that only 20% of the holdings of RCA could be in the hands of foreigners. So we can check that off of this pivotal era. Another issue of the Radio Broadcast Magazine that Hooper wrote in, this is the October issue. He wrote in the June 1922 issue. They're doing a profile of radio personalities, and this issue is dedicated to Hooper. And Owen Young writes a preface to this profile of Hooper. Owen Young says, "The initiative which brought into being our American radio policy and resulted in preventing us from being outdistanced by other nations started with Hooper. It was he who spurred on Admiral Bullard, his superior officer, in his negotiations with the General Electric Company. I don't want to detract in any way from the able work of Admiral Bullard. Commander Hooper could not have accomplished what he did without the Admiral's assistance. A commander can always use help from an admiral. But the original thought, the initiative, and persistent pushing were Hooper's, and he should have full credit for them." So government to private enterprise. Radio stations had been taken over by the government during World War I, and now in 1920, Woodrow Wilson issues an executive order that stations be returned and delivered to respective owners, and that would be at midnight on the 29th day of February, 1920, leap year. So that's 1920 February. Armistice was November 11th, 1918. That's a long time between government ownership and private ownership after the end of the war. Armistice, November 18th, RCA in business, December 1919, and in a couple of months later, private stations are returned to the owners by the government. So why did it take so long to get from war to peace? The answer comes from Hooper. We were very desirous of transferring other than the Navy stations back to private ownership as soon as the deal could be accomplished. The deal is the formation of RCA and eliminating foreign ownership of American technology. This also makes the point, Navy had radio stations. We're talking today about private enterprise, commercial radio stations, the American radio industry, but the government had radio stations. Navy was well equipped with long distance and short distance radio stations and on board ships. So government to private enterprise, we can check off. This is the 1921 annual report for Radio Corporation of America, where they report that there are now 6 direct international radio communication circuits as follows. Great Britain and Hawaii and Japan, both these opened operating March 1st, 1920. That's the day after the return to private ownership. And Norway is a service that's opened May 17th, 1920. So there's a delay in opening the service to Norway. Young can explain that to us. He's testifying in 1921 before Congress, and he says the sending station used for Norway is Marion, that's Marion, Massachusetts, with the receiving station at Chatham. This circuit was opened on May 17, 1920. I may say at this point that the reason for the delay in opening the Norwegian circuit was that the Marion station had been equipped with Marconi time spark apparatus and this apparatus had never successfully operated. So this is the existing technology the Marconi had patented that was not going to live up to the needs of modern communication when faced with the General Electric technology. With great effort, these alternators, we looked at that machine a little while ago, the alternators from General Electric with accessories were provided so as to open the Norwegian circuit on May 17th. So Chatham and Marion operated as one station with the operators doing their work here in Chatham and the transmitting facility operating in Marion. In 2020, on the side of our building here, we had this banner, Chatham on the Air, 100 years ago, May 17th. Radio station here in the United States went by call letters WSO, and the Norwegian station went by call letters LCM. And this link between the United States and Norway went into operation in 1920. Spark to CW, little piece from another Navy publication. The war period has also seen the complete abandonment of spark transmitters for long-distance communication. They were in use, the Marconi system was not working well, and with technology marching on, spark was at the end of its days in long-distance communication. Government to private enterprise, here's another aspect of it. Here's a hearing that was held in 1919 titled Government Ownership or Control of Radio Telegraphy and Cable Communication in its Military and Commercial Aspects. Well, there were many hearings that addressed this topic, 1917, 18, 19, 1920. Hearings about government ownership of radio. The government had taken control of radio during the war and had returned it on March 1st, February 29th, March 1st, 1920. But there were still hearings. So this is 18 days after returning the radio to private ownership. And Mr. Kintner, Sam Kintner, representing IRT, International Radio Telegraph, is testifying. And he says, at each session of Congress, the Navy introduces a new bill which tends more and more toward government ownership. And the Navy is given something out of each of these bills. Some sort of compromise is effected, and there's a settlement of the matter that's amicable for the time being, and then they come back the next year and get a little more. So there's a constant push for government ownership of radio in this era after World War I. And Kintner also points out that the Secretary of the Navy is already on record as saying he will not permit privately owned stations on these shores. Well, 1920 was an election year. Hearing on Wednesday, December 22nd, 1920, in committee. There's a little byplay between two of the committee members. And in discussion, one of them says, "You'll admit the present Secretary of the Navy won't be there very long." His party had lost the election. His colleague on the committee says, "For which favor do thanks." So government did not prevail. Private enterprise prevailed after the war, and American radio was on its way in peacetime. Another aspect of war and peace, during wartime, technology advanced, and in the radio field, it advanced remarkably, and it was due to the fact that patent rights, intellectual property rights, were suspended during the war. Anybody could use any invention, and put together a system, components, techniques, ways of doing things that resulted in exceptional advance in the technology of radio. This is summed up in a little piece by the National Bureau of Standards. I like this wording. The moratorium on patent litigation ended with the war. The wartime work on vacuum tubes, radio circuits, and transmission apparatus remained out of reach to all. So after the war, the patent holders that had ceded their rights during the war are back defending their patent rights. In that Federal Trade Commission report, there's a quote from a distinguished inventor. Radio people know this man, Edwin Armstrong. He's quoted as saying, "It was absolutely impossible to manufacture any kind of workable apparatus without using practically all the inventions that were then known." Practically all the inventions. Well, here you go. This is 23 pages from that report. This is not 23 inventions. This is not 23 patents. This is 23 lists with maybe 40 or so patents listed on each page of inventions that pertain to radio. Owen Young, testifying some years later about this era, says that the Westinghouse Company, a big American manufacturing company, the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, the United Fruit Company, and the General Electric Company all had patents, but nobody had patents enough to make a system. And so there was a complete stalemate. Radio could not go ahead at all. So wartime advance stagnated right after the war, and this is a problem. Companies are asserting their patent rights. How do we solve this problem? And the answer comes from Hooper. He testifies in 1929 about this era and says, "I wrote a letter to the companies that owned these patents, or rather I should say that I drafted a letter which my superior signed and appealed to them to get together and make some arrangement." So January 5th, 1920, the letter goes out. This is the text of the letter. I'll extract a little from it. This is the Hepburn letter. Hepburn was Hooper's superior at this time. And in it, he says, "The Bureau has constantly held the point of view that all interests will be best served through some agreement between the several holders of pertinent patents. This letter may be considered as an appeal for the good of the public for a remedy to the situation." Similar letter is being addressed to the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, New York City. So General Electric, participating in the Radio Corporation of America, AT&T, get a letter from Hooper pleading for some resolution to this patent stalemate. Well, they listened. Yet RCA Annual Report for 1920, the American Telephone and Telegraph Company has recently become a large stockholder in your corporation. United Fruit Company has likewise become a substantial stockholder. Agreements were worked out and shares were taken on by these other companies that had patent rights, and these patent licensing agreements facilitated the development of radio after the war. The annual report for 1921 goes on to say that the corporation, after a long series of negotiations, entered into agreement with IRT, International Radio Telegraph, and Westinghouse. Now it is possible for the corporation to develop, free from the previously existent patent restrictions, both receiving and sending apparatus essential to the furtherance of the art. Owen Young, in 1929, looking back 8 years, says, "All that I remember about that period is that we found out after the organization of the Radio Corporation of America that Westinghouse Company was in a position to block radio reception." So the idea that American self-interest yielded to enlightened self-interest among these various companies took a little bit of doing. Westinghouse didn't come along right away, but ultimately did, and it was to the benefit of the American radio industry. Young, on another occasion in 1921, is delivering an address, a very important address, and in it he addresses this situation that existed then and the resolution. He says, "America could not wait for the duplication of the history of the telephone company or the duplication of the electrical industry. She could not wait 10 years while her people were fighting." And he means fighting over patents. Because the communications of the world were at stake, and America's position in those communications was at stake. So, pivotal era, war to peace, government to private enterprise, technology, old technology to new technology, and British influence in America to all-American influence in America. We can check all these off. That leaves transoceanic to marine. This is particularly applicable to the situation here in Chatham. 100 years ago, Chatham Maritime Radio went on the air. Radio Corporation's annual report for the end of 1920. Your corporation recently acquired a large tract of land, nearly 10 square miles, near Port Jefferson, Long Island. And then there's a lot of particulars. Sum up what was going to happen. Radio Central, a new facility, was being built in 1921. In 1921, additional new transmitting facility, new receiving facility, both these on Long Island, Rocky Point and Riverhead. And there was going to be centralized operation in New York City. The annual report for 1921 sums it up. Central radio office in New York, where all transmission and reception work is now concentrated, and where specially trained and highly skilled staff is doing the work which formerly required duplicate staffs at the outlying radio stations. Duplicate staffs in outlying radio stations. Well, here's a couple of outlying radio stations, Chatham and Marion. Been on the air for a year or so, communicating with Europe. But all transmission and reception work is in New York. What about Chatham and Marion? Well, April 1921, RCA issues Special Order 138, which announces that on or about April 10th, 1921, the Radio Corporation's Cape Cod Marine Station will be open for general public service. Continuous and interrupted continuous wave tube transmitters will be used. There's a little bit of particular here. Receiving apparatus is at Chatham. The transmitter is located in Marion, being distantly controlled from Chatham, and the call letters are WCC. So this is the announcement that Chatham is giving up its position as an element of transoceanic communication and will focus from now on on marine activities, ship-to-shore activities. This is signed by David Sarnoff, a well-known radio figure who was at this time commercial manager of RCA. In this report, this announcement, it also says that on or about the same date, we shall open to general public service a Spark station. Notice that our WCC was a vacuum tube station. Spark station, receiving apparatus for which will be located at Belmar and transmitter at New Brunswick. So the New Jersey station is being outfitted at this time too. This order says on or about April 10th. Actually, we have a little more about that because this is the superintendent's diary from Chatham, Massachusetts, kept by Superintendent Walter E. Wood. And in it he records that on Monday, April 18th, 1921, at 1:30 p.m., opened the marine station for commercial traffic. This is the birth of WCC in Chatham, April 18th, 1921. We celebrated this on April 18th of this year, when we could say that it was 100 years to the day that since the radio station went on the air in marine service. Today I figured it out. This is 100 years and 56 days. It doesn't have quite the same ring to it, but it's a good story anyway. In January 1921, RCA was advertising for radio operators because of the pending opening of the marine station here. It was still doing transatlantic work, and in the offing was the marine activity that would be coming later in the spring. Here's somebody who responded to and was employed here, and his name is Forrest Robinson. He wrote in January 1966 that Chatham was sure a sleepy little village 45 years ago. There were a half dozen horse and buggy commuters in town. We came by railroad, a 3-hour ride from Boston. If operators or visitors were expected, they were met at the railroad station in the company's Model T passenger car. It was a bit chilly in the winter with side curtains and the wind whistling through the floorboards. We saw that company car parked next to the station in an earlier slide. Here's a better view of it. And here's the time record that we have that pertains to this era in the development of the radio station. Radio station went on the air in early 1920, transatlantic, and they advertised at the beginning of 1921 for more operators to handle continuing transatlantic traffic and the pending marine traffic. And they came. Here's the Chatham staff as of April 1921. It was handling the communications from Marine Station WCC and Transatlantic Station WSO. So transoceanic to marine involved the vacuum tube. We saw that vacuum tube transmitters would be used. There we are. And somewhere in this list of patents are the patents that pertain to vacuum tubes. In 1921, we start to see vacuum tubes advertised, the patent situation being pretty well resolved. Deliveries of vacuum tubes begin on March 10th to the experimenting public. Radio vacuum tubes for transmission. Radio transmitters are advertised, and In this issue of the magazine, The Wireless Age, there's an article about 2 new coastal stations will use tube transmitters for the first time in ship-to-shore work. Those 2 stations are Chatham on Cape Cod, WCC, and Belmar in New Jersey, call letters WNY. Here's a picture in this article of what that transmitter looked like. A very straightforward construction. There's the tubes in the side view, and the use of tube sets marks a distinct advance in commercial radio industry. Here's another transmitter that came along a little later. It still has those nice tubes in it. Interior, within the receiving station, vacuum tubes are used in the receivers. This is a receiver, a design which stems from the war years. And radio station is now, here in Chatham, is now operating on receivers based on vacuum tubes and transmitters based on vacuum tubes. RCA lists in 1921 their extensive marine coastal station service. Chatham, Cape Cod, call letters WCC, leads the list. And then the particulars of these listed stations, we see that Chatham has a 2 kilowatt tube set, two tube sets. New London, Connecticut has a spark set. Brooklyn, New York has spark sets. New Jersey has spark sets. California has spark sets. WCC in Chatham has tubes, and the others are all still working with spark. The Radio Corporation's Belmar, New Brunswick Marine Station is announced in 1921 that it has permanently closed, and the call letters have now been transferred to New York. So in June, they announced that Chatham and Belmar would be marine stations equipped with tubes, but a few months later, the Belmar station is closed. That didn't happen to Chatham. It could have, and the operators here were worried about it, but it didn't happen. RCA put the technology of post-war American radio into Chatham and kept it on the air. Wireless Age. Did you notice the cover of the magazine where that listing of coast stations was? There's a photograph, here's the photograph of an assemblage of dignitaries. They assembled at the New Brunswick station, and one in particular is a visitor who visited the United States in April, a visitor from Europe. If we were all together today in person, I would expect somebody in the audience to yell out who that is. I'll have to do it myself. That's Albert Einstein, visited the United States in 1921, and paid a visit to the great RCA station in New Jersey. And on that occasion, he wrote out a message to the officer in charge of the German station in Nauen. This was sent to Nauen via the Radio Corporation station at Marion. At this time, Marion's being keyed directly from New York, per that arrangement that we saw before. And an answer was received at Chatham and relayed to the New York office. So although this is reported in June, the actual occurrence was April. So this is during the transition when Chatham is still receiving from Europe, and Riverhead on Long Island is not yet in operation. The exchange between Einstein and the operator in Germany was reprinted in the magazine. Greetings from New York, signed Einstein, and Many thanks to the great German scholar from the officer in charge of POZ. You saw that these two were labeled Marconigrams. Another thing that happened about this time in 1921 was that RCA adopted the new expression radiogram and branded communications through the RCA stations as via RCA. So there's a radiogram blank where radiogram is prominently at the top and via RCA is prominently in the header. So New York, all transmission and reception work for long distance, duplicate staffs. September 1921, in the publication called Worldwide Wireless, which is an RCA publication, which is by and for employees, there's correspondence from various RCA operations, radio stations, offices, so forth. And correspondent from Chatham writes in, because there's a rivalry brewing, the way I'll put it, there's a rivalry brewing. Chatham writes in and says, "We have heard vague rumors that RD, that's company talk for Riverhead, the receiving station on Long Island, is quite a receiving station, and it's quite possible that within the course of the next year or two, the Riverhead station will be able to receive European traffic as efficiently as Chatham." So this is a little bit of bravado and maybe a little bit of hurt feelings. Chatham was doing work that's now being taken away and sent to Riverhead. This is toward the tail end of 1921, and Chatham, a number of employees here, has peaked. It's healthy, but it's at its peak. In December, the Chatham correspondent writes to the same newsletter that our staff has been considerably depleted on account of Radio Central, Riverhead, taking over reception from POZ, that's the German station that Einstein communicated with, but Chatham is still handling considerable traffic from LCM, Norway, OUI, Hanover, Germany, and the long and shortwave marine sets. So indeed, the Chatham staff was depleted. Belmar has closed. Chatham is working. They have good equipment, but they're losing employees because the business that was here during the long distance transoceanic days is fading. So transoceanic to marine, RCA annual report for 1921 says that the station in Chatham, Massachusetts is one of the most efficient marine radio stations in existence, capable of carrying on simultaneous communication with 3 ships. Reliable radio telegraph communication is maintained with the principal ocean liners up to 2,500 to 3,000 miles distant. This is quite an accomplishment for the technology of the day. Technology is going to advance even further as the 20s go on, and this is 1921. So by the end of 1922, the number of employees here in Chatham has plummeted. It's down around the 20. This is all employees, including clerical and hotel help, let's say. And compared to the staff photo from April 1921, this 1922 photo has the reduced number of employees. So the annual report for 1922 continues that your corporation continues to own and operate marine radio stations at the following points, several of them. Chatham's on the top, of course. Sconset-on-Nantucket, New London, Connecticut, New York, Cape May, New Jersey, and San Francisco are all still working. The volume of marine traffic, communications between ships at sea and between ships and shore stations, here at the end of 1922, increased in the last year 105% in volume. The bulk of this traffic has been handled through your corporation's Marine Radio Central at Chatham, Massachusetts. So Chatham is successful. The company refers to it as Marine Radio Central. When they announced that they were building a brand new big facility on Long Island, it was dubbed Radio Central, and parallel to that, in the Marine Division, Chatham is Marine Radio Central. Annual report for 1923, Chatham is provided with the most modern equipment and is thoroughly efficient coastal station, giving greater efficiency at reduced costs. So it continues apace, let's say, 1923, same number of employees doing a good deal of work efficiently. We come to 1924 and a list of RCA coast stations. Again, Chatham at the top, and here, Marion Chatham, particulars about how they work, and because of the position they hold in the RCA organization, the technology that's been applied, the most efficient operation, the skilled employees, first-class radio operators. At this point, RCA calls WCC in Chatham the world's greatest coastal station. So that ends our discussion of transoceanic to marine. And if we look at what we were going to talk about today, we covered the pivotal era in the history of communications that put Chatham out at the forefront as the world's greatest coastal station. That about winds up the formal presentation, but I do have a few closing remarks about what happened in the following years. If we look back at this RCA brochure from 1949 and beyond the first few pages, RCA at this time is a pillar of 20th century American industry, and this brochure is called RCA What It Is, What It Does, and in explaining what it is and what it does, there are 7 sections. One of the sections is broadcasting. This is the NBC Symphony Orchestra on that page that introduced the broadcasting section. This is television. There's NBC Television Studios, this section. Communications, long-distance communications, and marine radio. If we look at marine radio, page that introduces that section, what we see is the interior of Radio Marine's modern transmitter building at South Chatham. If we look at the text that goes with it, and the photograph at the top is a photograph of the interior of the station here in Chatham-Port. So what it is, what it does, this is where I say if you asked RCA what it does in marine radio here in the middle of the 20th century, the answer is Chatham. This image of the Chatham Port Station, featured in this brochure in 1949, is what greets visitors to our museum today. It's the mural that you see when you enter the building to visit the exhibits. 1977, a little further into the century, Chatham's still at the forefront. Some correspondence signed by the manager of WCC, Ed Hammonds. He points out in this letter that he's writing, Chatham Radio WCC is the largest U.S. coast station in the Marine Service, and we operate in all the Marine bands from medium frequency through the 22 megahertz band. This last part means that Chatham Radio is versatile, it's capable, and can deal with communicating with the ships of the world. 1997, the station closed. Reflections on what we've seen today. Transitional period from post-World War I, war to peace, government to private enterprise. What if the government had not given the radio stations back? Spark to CW, what if foreign interests, British Marconi, had managed to preempt American radio by taking over the General Electric patents? Transoceanic to Marine here in Chatham secured the future of the station. Other sites were not as fortunate. When we looked at the array of radio stations that RCA had after World War I, the Hawaii stations were Kahuku and Koko Head. This is what Kahuku looks like in the 21st century. No roof on the building, no windows in the building, it's gone to ruin. Well, that didn't happen at Chatham. Chatham had a full life. It received all the support it could ever expect from RCA in building a marine station that served mariners of the world. 2010, we opened a museum here in the operating building of Chatham. Today, we're celebrating, along with historic Chatham, our town's past, and with Chatham Radio that went on the air 100 years ago, April 18th, 1:30 p.m. Chatham stayed at the forefront, was renowned among mariners of the world. Chatham's past was shared by world seafarers well beyond the shores of Chatham, and Chatham stayed in that service for most of the 20th century.